Our rights are not protected, but downgraded. In fact, this exclusion infers that we are not equal citizens.
We have no intention of disenfranchising anybody or disempowering anybody. Nothing could be further from our intention.
The solution must be clear before the referendum. Otherwise, we cannot know how the disabled community, which is very upset about the exclusion, is going to behave on October 26.
Hello, and welcome to an all-new season of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. This season, we'll be bringing you the latest in news affecting people with disabilities, as well as several in-depth documentary programs. Today, we'll focus on the upcoming referendum on the Charlottetown Constitutional Accord. The fact that people with disabilities were not mentioned in the Canada Clause has upset many in the disability rights movement. They feel that they're being asked to make a choice between the future of Canada and their rights as citizens. We'll take an in-depth look at their concerns in a moment. But first, here's this week's roundup of disability news. The first ever International Conference of Ministers responsible for the status of disabled persons met in Montreal earlier last week. Representatives of 75 countries established a working group. It will deal with issues of concern to people with disabilities. They reconvened at the United Nations on October 12th. The chair of the committee, Robert Decotre, Canada's Secretary of State, was seeking support from the General Assembly. He said that the committee will be responsive to the needs of consumers.
We are committed to working with disabled persons and their organizations to heighten public understanding of the goals set by disabled persons themselves.
The ministers were accompanied by representatives of disability organizations. One of their main disappointments about the Decade of Disabled Persons is that there were no financial commitments from the UN. Henry Enns is the chairperson of Disabled Persons International.
And we now are hopeful that this meeting will in fact result in some significant initiatives to mount action beyond the decade, and particularly to include disabled people in the regular budgets of the United Nations, which has never been done during the decade.
The latest analysis of population figures have just been released by Statistics Canada. The 1991 census shows that the number of Canadians reporting a disability has risen.
Sam Savona is one of more than 4 million Canadians who reported a disability on the 1991 census questionnaire. That's 15.5% of the population, and it's up from 13.2% reported in the 1986 survey. Part of the increase is due to Canada's aging population. But Statistics Canada says there's another reason.
Canadians are just more sensitive to the issues facing persons with disabilities, and as a result, people are more comfortable coming forward and saying that they do have a limitation.
The limitations most often reported were mobility and agility disabilities among Canadians. But for younger people, it was a different story. 43% of 15 to 34-year-olds with disabilities reported that they perceived they were limited because of a psychological handicap.
I think that the survey has shown that there is a population in Canada who experience some barriers in the conduct of their everyday lives, that there are barriers that exist, for example, with respect to employment, to transportation, to accommodation.
For Betty Davidson, who is blind, the biggest barrier was getting a job.
Very seldom do you really get a job, any person with a disability, unless it's within the disability network.
And so as Canadians have become more comfortable in reporting their disabilities over the last 5 years, they've become less tolerant of the barriers they face. Next year, Statistics Canada will release data on their education, employment, and income levels. Data which will measure whether the barriers have become any fewer. Maureen Boyd, CBC News, Ottawa.
And that's this week's roundup of disability news. When we come back, we'll take a look at the latest constitutional proposal, the Charlottetown Accord, and the concerns about rights that it has raised among disabled people. The national referendum for the latest constitutional proposal is just around the corner. The agreement reached in Charlottetown on August 28th has riveted the attention of people across this country, especially people with disabilities and the equality rights movement. Most of the time, our rights are discussed in very abstract legal and legislative ways, but rights are really about how people live their lives in society. As we heard earlier, more than 15% of Canadians are disabled. Many of them will be making their way to the polls on October 26th.
Hi, Eric.
Oh, hi, Judith.
Nice day for a referendum, eh?
One of those persons is Judith Snow. She is here at her accessible polling station meeting another equality rights activist.
You're going to be voting here during the referendum, isn't it? And I understand that, I heard that about, 98% of the polls are going to be accessible. And
only 98? I thought they all had to be.
Yeah, well, okay. But
During the 10-year period since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and before, Judith Snow has been an active proponent of integration for persons with disabilities. She first discovered the difference that her disability made to her life at the age of 4. It happened at school.
I remember the day I recognized that I was different from other people was the day that the teacher decided to put the boys on one side of the room and the girls on the other side of the room. And I happened to be sitting on the boys' side, and she wouldn't help me go across to the other side. And it kind of hit home to me at that moment that my inability to walk was going to be more important than my sex, my interests, my color, my class, or anything, right?
That realization led Judith to fight for the services she needed in order to be placed on a more equal basis with other members of society. But the nature of that fight changed following a life-and-death stay in hospital.
It was the discovery that I was dying not of spinal muscular atrophy, but of neglect and of loneliness and of a belief that I wasn't worthy, my own belief in my lack of worthiness at that point. That those were the things that were really killing me. It was that discovery that really kicked me into action. The fight that I'm fighting and the fight that other people are fighting more and more is the fight to be able to participate as citizens in the country and not just as people who need to be taken care of.
This struggle took persons with disabilities to Ottawa in 1981 to ensure that they were recognized in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Alan Simpson of Winnipeg was among those who pressed then Justice Minister John Chrétien to include them in the Charter.
We warned him and we were honest. Our membership will remain vigilant and outspoken.
Persons with disabilities were subsequently included in Section 15, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in 1982.
The Constitution is now home.
I think one of the values of the inclusion in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms has been that people have become more aware that they do have rights and that they really are citizens. So that certainly is a value.
And due in part to the recognition of these rights, society has made steps towards integration.
I only accessed the Ombudsman's office within the last 10 years. And it's a real useful place to be able to get into when you want to advocate for the rights of people to be treated the way they ought to be treated. For many, many of those 10 years, the only access was in the back with a ramp that went into their Xerox room. And the door was locked and you had to buzz for a security person to come and let you in and also to let you out. And if that person wasn't available, of course, you could sit out in the cold for quite a while. You could be freezing out there for hours. So more recently, they've put up a ramp in the front. We've made some progress, and it's far from perfect. Ideally, we ought to have been able to go through every piece of legislation in all the provinces and being able to say, the fact that you set up this so that people have to go to nursing homes is discrimination. We can get rid of that now. The fact that public transportation is not accessible is discrimination. We can get rid of that now. We should have been able to go bang, 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 bang and really make a lot of very fundamental changes. But the notwithstanding clause meant that the provinces didn't even bother looking, by and large, at their legislation and their programs. They just laughed in their own way.
The agreement that we have reached today is very significant, and I hope that it provides the same kind of leadership and strength for Canada for decades to come.
It's not simply an issue of legislation that we're talking about. It's an issue of a deep cultural impression that if a person has a limitation of their body or a limitation of their mind or something like that, that they are somehow unable. That's what the word disabled means, unable. And it doesn't occur to lawyers and judges, or basically doesn't often even occur to the person themselves, that it's not an issue of inability, it's an issue of discrimination.
Justice now! Justice now!
People with disabilities have been active in fighting that discrimination and vigilant in defense of their rights during the entire decade of the 80s.
As you may remember, the initial wording contained in Section 15 in the about 1980 did not include the rights of persons with disabilities. Consequently, and some of you will remember this, disabled people were compelled to mount an intense and persistent campaign to convince the politicians to include the rights of people with disabilities in Section 15 of the Charter.
As defined persons, we are supposed to share the same values and human rights as everybody else. The key difference is that being deafblind, most of us do not even know we have these values or rights because of the lack of information accessibility.
The minister understood clearly the message, and as I said, the message is that we want to be included and that we want specific references to disability in the Constitution.
It does have a very positive psychological effect to put something in a charter that says you have rights, but to actually make it happen is a lot of hard work. Historically, there is a huge discrimination against people who are perceived as being disabled. And people say that when you have a historical debt to fill up from, as we do in our society, it's useful to have those debts written into a constitution so that people remember that they have a debt owed to people who are labeled disabled, and they ought to be doing something real quick and real powerful right now to address that.
A federal government draft proposal for a Canadian constitution, Shaping Canada's Future Together, was published in 1991. This document proposed that a Canada Clause be added to the Canadian Constitution. It would have affirmed the identity and aspirations of the people of Canada. There was a commitment to fairness, openness, and full participation in Canada's citizenship by all people without regard to race, color, creed, physical or mental disability, or cultural background. The 11 First Ministers and representatives of the 2 territories and First Nations signed the Charlottetown Accord on August 28th of this year. It did include a Canada Clause, but contained no reference to physical or mental disability. A few days later, disability activists protested in the House of Commons.
By leaving us out of the final draft of the Canada Clause, which speaks of the fundamental characteristics of Canada, our rights are not protected, but downgraded. In fact, this exclusion infers that we are not equal citizens. People have said that we are protected under the Charter of the Rights and Freedoms, but as an interpretive clause, the Canada Clause takes precedence, so it is imperative that we are included there.
People with disabilities are not willing to accept good faith for their full participation in Canadian society. We must be included back in the Canada Clause and call upon the federal government and the premiers to reinstate people with disabilities and give them the equality rights that we deserve.
We feel that the way things stand right now leaves our rights in a very vulnerable and threatened position.
We felt betrayed. We felt that the political leaders had just simply not lived up to their own responsibility of making sure that we were included. We had representatives there through all of the conferences.
I think that before the document is completed and ratified by the premiers and the prime minister, they're going to have to take a second look and include everyone in that document of constitution.
One of our memorable meetings to me, Angelo, was on the street corner in
3 weeks after the accord was signed, people with disabilities did meet with Clark to take a second look, and he acknowledged that their concern was in a category by itself.
I thought there were two issues here. One is an issue of law. The other is an issue really of inclusion or exclusion. I personally believe that the legal questions are a matter for lawyers. There are a variety of views, although a very careful position, legal position, have been put forward by the disabled community. My interest is more in the question of inclusion or exclusion. I made it very clear that we cannot reopen the agreement of the 28th of August until First Ministers meet after a referendum.
The Minister has undertaken to write to the First Ministers across the country and seek a solution to the exclusion of persons with disabilities. We insisted that the solution must be clear before the referendum, otherwise we cannot know how the disabled community, which is very upset about the exclusion, is going to behave on October 26. He couldn't make any guarantees, and we couldn't make any guarantees either.
Angelo?
Hi.
Bob Ray. Nice to see you. Hi, Angelo. It's Ross. How are you? Nice to see you. How are you?
Representatives of disability organizations met with premiers of many provinces, including Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and Ontario. When the legal text was released on October 13th, there had been no changes to the Canada Clause. People with disabilities had not been added.
I mean, the arguments that I've heard made, for example, somebody saying, well, there's a hierarchy of rights, and if you're not mentioned there, you're going to be, you're not going to have the same level of rights. I don't agree with that argument legally. I don't think that it's correct. But in order to deal with the issue of the comfort level, the political acceptability, people's willingness to, people's mistrust, if you like, and to counter that, I've said, look, I mean, I think that the important point is for us to respond to that. We have no intention of disenfranchising anybody or disempowering anybody. Nothing could be further from our intention. The sense was, and as I say, no one makes claims to being omniscient or all-seeing, but certainly our intention throughout the piece has been to include people. And we took the Charter, in a sense, as a given. The Charter is there. The rights in 15.1 and 15.2 are very substantial. It's now up to governments and others to push ahead with legislation that will make them more real. But if the Canada Clause needs to be improved, it will be improved. I mean, the main concern that I think people with disabilities would have would be with respect to the notwithstanding clause. I mean, it's the government's use of a notwithstanding clause under the Charter that potentially could cause problems. And, people can criticize us for not dealing with that. We made a political decision not to deal with it simply because there was no way of developing a consensus on it.
In that sense, there ought to be something in the Canada Clause that says, Canada and all of Western society, but certainly Canada, has historically discriminated very powerfully against people who don't walk or don't speak or don't see and all that kind of stuff. And that we need to very powerfully act to get the supports in place for people to participate.
Joining me now is DNET producer Bill McQueen, who's been working on this story. Bill, what's the latest reaction from organizations across the country?
Well, Susan, for most of the month of September and October, the Coalition of Provincial Organizations of the Handicapped, COPO, and the Canadian Disability Rights Council, CDRC, have engaged in a non-stop campaign to re-include persons with disabilities in the Canada Clause of the Charlottetown Accord. Out in the West, Premier Getty of Alberta has declined to meet with the Alberta Committee of Citizens with Disabilities, and in British Columbia, the BC Coalition of People with Disabilities and the Disabled Women's Network Canada are advocating no to the Constitutional Accord. COPO and CDRC have also scheduled a press conference on October 20th to give their response to the failure to include in the legal text of the Constitutional Accord persons with disabilities. While on the 19th, People United for Self-Help in Ontario have scheduled a no rally on October 19th. But of course, we'll have to wait until the completion of the referendum before we know the full response of the more than 4 million persons with disabilities in Canada.
Thanks, Bill. We'll be back in a moment. In the season ahead, we'll be keeping you in touch with issues and stories that affect people with disabilities. This season, we'll also be producing a greater number of documentary programs. Here's a sample of some of the in-depth coverage in the weeks to come.
Well, this song's all about what we all came here for the music part of it anyway.
Next week, we'll go to the Eaglewood Earth Festival, a get-together of musicians, performers, and craftspeople. The festival was fully accessible to people with disabilities, but it was held just outside of a small community, Sutton, a town that isn't quite so integrated.
Further down the street at a variety store, we were again told that there was access at the back. Is that it? There's no way I can get in there. I guess some people's ideas of accessible is a little different.
Those people in South Africa who speak it. Yeah. I'm from there. I'm a Zulu.
And for those of you who didn't get to go to Independence 92 in April, you'll have the opportunity to see what the conference was all about later in the season. Held in Vancouver, it was the largest international gathering of disabled people ever.
I think the message here is that when you're dealing with over 13% of the population that share a common bond, that's a force that's got to be reckoned with. It's a huge potential for political change.
The conference touched on many key issues and reflected the sense of pride that people with disabilities have gained over recent years.
We're going to find that as more and more disabled people are visible, active, participating, leading members of our society, less and less fear and stigma will be associated with disability. We've moved a long way in the last 20 years. From the days we go into a pub and everyone would buy us a beer. We couldn't buy our own beer. This was courageous. Now they don't even look at us in the pub. We have to buy our own beer. So that's progress.
There's no question that I see it increasing and becoming much more of a problem.
Since 1940, diabetes has been escalating among Aboriginal Canadians. DNET will be examining the human impact of this disease and the controversy around finding ways to stop its path of destruction.
We have a number of people who are on renal dialysis, who are blind, who have one or both legs off.
But if there's monies there for programs or whatever to do something to help the diabetics and stuff like that, that we should be squawking and we should be getting it.
We have to have more dollars to look after us people that have this disease called diabetes.
And that's our show. I'm Susan Pettit-Crossman. We'd like to hear from you. If you have any thoughts on the constitutional referendum, positive or negative, write to us. And here's our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Or you can fax us at 416-975-5636.